The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Anger and resentment may not lead to the most civic-minded kinds of politics, but they do seem to get people involved. Tonight, does it matter which one motivates a person? And does that push people across the political spectrum in different directions? Then, political scientist Glory Liu is with us on her new book about the first economist, Adam Smith, and why he was far from the rapacious supporter of capitalism some have made him out to be. It's Wednesday, March 29th, and that's next on The Agenda. Politics has often been referred to as war by other means. To look at the political climate in many places today, that feels especially apt, given the levels of anger and resentment on display. But anger is not the same as resentment, ultimately, and understanding how they differ might be quite telling about the political forces seeking to sway the public. For their thoughts on this, we're joined in London, UK, by Teresa Capellos, Associate Professor of Political Psychology at the University of Birmingham. In Chicago, Illinois, Agnes Callard, Associate Professor in Philosophy at the University of Chicago. And in our nation's capital, journalist and author David Moscrop. And we're delighted to have the three of you with us on TVO tonight. I want to just set up our conversation by asking our director, Sheldon Osmond, to put this graphic up because we've got a bit of information we want to share. Gallup runs something called the Global Emotions Index. They do it in 122 countries. And according to its 2022 edition of Negative Experience Index, which consists of self-reported experiences of worry, stress, sadness, physical pain, and anger, it reached a 33 out of 100. 33. That is apparently the highest it has been since the measurement started in 2006, when it was just at 24. And if we focus on anger, 23% of those surveyed felt it. David, to you first. A Washington Post column of last year was entitled "Rage Has Poisoned Public Life in Canada," and you wrote, "We should distinguish between righteous and toxic anger." So let's do that. Draw the distinction for us, if you would.
I remember getting called into the principal's office in, I think it was 7th or 8th grade, and being told, "You're angry, kid." And that's okay. But what you would do with that anger matters a great deal. And so you can distinguish, I mean, to be a little more precise about the effects of that anger. It can become productive. It can be channeled into, for instance, assessing the state of not just your own situation, but the sort of structural problems that developed in the first place. Or it can create a kind of backlash against other people. It can build solidarity and movement for change, or it can result in a kind of turning inwards and, as I mentioned, a lashing out, which, for instance, might lead to, let's say, occupying the capital city of a country and staying there for weeks. So it matters a great deal what kind of form that takes. And in the social media age, the digital media age, there's a sort of tendency by elites, political elites, media elites, business elites, to try to harness a lot of that anger for their own ends, which ends up producing lots of toxic outcomes. And I was worried a great deal that where we were, elites were corralling folks in very, very dangerous ways that were going to pay off in very, very dangerous outcomes.
Well, let me do a quick follow-up with you, since you mentioned the January 6th insurrection. Are you saying left-wing anger good, but right-wing anger bad?
Well, I would say that as a market socialist, wouldn't I? I mean, but there isn't anything inherently right or wrong about left or right-wing anger, but I would say contemporary history, not so contemporary history as well, often bears out the case that there are forms of right-wing anger that are extraordinarily toxic, left-wing too, but on balance they tend to manifest in very different ways, although not universally. I would still say the preponderance of right-wing anger has been more toxic and destructive than left-wing anger, but that's a whole different episode maybe.
Indeed. Teresa, you've been writing about resentment for quite a time. Somebody you quoted calls it a psychological dynamite that threatens democracy. Why do you think?
Yeah. So there is a difference between resentment and ressentiment, which is an even more toxic, more hateful kind of resentment. And it can be a dynamite because what it does is it disengages the individuals that are experiencing this emotional mechanism from their own reality, the reality that is causing the frustrations, the pain, the grievances that they are reacting emotionally to. So although grievances highlight the frustrations and the need to address them socially and politically, the emotional responses that come out of that context are not ones that are conducive to pro-social solutions. They lean towards more antisocial preferences, more antisocial behaviors, which in the end compromise and stall the progress that they seek to invite. So they are counterproductive for their own, but they are dynamite for society in a sense that they have this tendency to undo what is already there.
Agnes, let me put some of your words back to you and have you explain what you meant by them. Because you've written, there are two problems with anger. It is morally corrupting and it is completely correct. Okay, explain.
Yeah, so I think the distinction between good and bad anger, as it's been drawn by David and Teresa, has been forward-looking. What do you do with the anger? But another question is, where did the anger come from? That is, what are your reasons for being angry? And sometimes we genuinely have reasons for being angry. So like the good anger would presumably be the anger where you had a reason, you were in fact justified, wrong was committed against you. And the problem is that if you have such a reason, you have that reason forever. That is, if the fact that somebody treated you unjustly is a reason to be angry, that never changes because the fact can't change because you can't go back in time. And that means there's a certain kind of rationality to like holding on to grudges. And the rational structure that kind of naturally creates in your soul is one where the other person's bad becomes your good. And that's the motive of revenge. And so revenge is naturally born out of anger. It's a natural consequence of anger. It's how you see things when you see things from an angry point of view. And that point of view could well be justified. And the justification doesn't expire. That's the scary thing about anger.
Well, you've prompted a couple of things in my head. Number one, that old Irish expression, what's the point of a good grudge if you can't hold it forever? And the second, as I watched Teresa shaking her head, kind of reminds me of something that I discussed with Martha Nussbaum on this program many years ago. And let's play a clip from that, and then we'll pick up the conversation. Shelton, if you would.
Anger is a pained response to what the person thinks of as a significant damage to that person's well-being that was wrongfully inflicted. Now, so far, so good. Lots of things meet that description, and it's good to notice wrongful damages when they occur. But then, what is added is that the angry person wishes and hopes that there will be some kind of payback. In other words, believes that the doer should suffer. Now that's where I think we stop making sense. But the gut reaction that says somebody's got to pay and I'm going to solve my anguish about this death by making that doctor pay, that is by itself an irrational reaction and it doesn't do any good. So I think that the anger that people feel comes from the fact that they just don't know how to solve the problem, and they'd rather not face the real problem. They'd rather just hit somebody over the head with a stick and then pretend that that helps to solve the problem.
Now, Agnes, that's your fellow Chicagoan saying that vengefulness or an eye for an eye doesn't solve the problem. What do you say to that?
I agree it doesn't solve the problem. But the question is it a rational response from the point of view of the person who has anger? And I think the answer to that is yes. And the way that you can see it is, I was having a discussion last night with journalist Liz Brunig, and one point of the conversation was parenting when your children get into a fight. And so the one child takes something away from the other, and the second child pulls the first child's hair. And the question is, do you treat them differently? And her approach is like, of course. I mean, the second child had a reason for pulling her sister's hair, namely, she'd had a dress snatched away from her. And so, I think that resonates with many people that, look, she wasn't unprovoked, which is to say the bad thing she did was provoked. The bad thing becomes a good thing because it was a response to another bad thing. In many contexts, we find that very intuitive. But when we really don't like the bad things people are doing, all of a sudden we get really alienated from the point of view of identifying with their anger. And we're like, that's bad. It's unproductive. It's always unproductive. It's unproductive even in the case of the little kid pulling your sister's hair. But it's also very intuitive.
Teresa, you were shaking your head earlier. You want to come back on that?
It's a very complicated topic, the one we are discussing. It's so interesting, all the little angles and the nuances and how we understand emotions. We talk about what is rational. Well, when we are describing anger, we should be thinking about emotional, affective, rather than rational. Rational is more the decision-making, a process of reaching a decision. But here now, at the essence of it, we talk about emotion. So we should be talking about affect rather than rationality. But what I think it is also important for us to distinguish is the impact of an emotion. Does it have an antisocial outcome or a prosocial outcome? And if you don't want to go as far as the outcome, we can think of intention. Is it an antisocial intention or a prosocial intention? Now, what's going on with revenge? If revenge is part of a desire to spoil, spoiling is not a characteristic of anger, it's a characteristic of envy. So although we could be talking about anger, and we could have this public conversation about who is angry, does anger contribute to the solution of society or not, at the end of the day, what people express as anger, what we are used to be identifying as anger, can be concealing other deeper affective states that can be painful: frustration and envy, guilt, shame, inefficacious anger as well. And what we have seen, and with the first poll that you showed us when we started this conversation, is this license to be expressing anger in today's society in a way, and there's benefits to that. It's good to be able to recognize emotions and talk about them, find the words and express them. But it's also really, so in a way, when you recognize an expression, when you ask somebody how do you feel, they can very quickly tell you, I'm angry. Now, does that mean that that's the only thing that they feel? Probably not. Does it mean that they have a word to put for the emotion that they're experiencing? Yes, it does. But for us, in political psychology and psychology as well, it is our responsibility to dig a little deeper and get to the bottom, the essence of that emotion. Is it just anger, or are people identifying themselves as angry because there is a public debate about anger, because anger has become very popular as part of the populist political scene? But effectively what they are feeling and what we see them feeling when we study that anger a little deeper is a little bit more nuanced. In some cases guilt, in some cases shame, in some cases envy. And envy is associated with a desire to spoil. So
well, let me jump in there for a second and put that to David, because this notion of let's make them pay, justified or not, David?
Well, the feeling is certainly justified insofar as it's a legitimate response to stimuli. We like to think of ourselves in terms of an Enlightenment legacy, right? We're rational, dispassionate, calculative machines. I wrote about this in my book. We're told that we are these we have this Enlightenment legacy of moving through the world and taking raw sensory data and compiling it and evaluating it as one might look at a spreadsheet, and then coming to some sort of ideal conclusion and then going forward with that, which is just absolute nonsense, right? It's just not how we really operate in the real world. We can try to approximate that, and sometimes we can get pretty close. Some people are pretty good at it. But we are fundamentally characterized by emotion. Emotion tends to be in the driver's seat. We spend a lot of time operating on a sort of fast, intuitive responses to the world around us, especially in a complicated world which is extraordinarily fast and difficult to navigate. And so, in a sense, we've created a world, developed a world, accidentally fallen bum backwards into a world that is almost feels like it's custom built to elicit angry responses and let us channel them into the world really, really quickly. Think of social media. So of course that makes a lot of sense. But as has been noted absolutely correctly, it's not super productive, right? In fact, it's deeply counterproductive. And anyone who's ever lashed out at someone and taken a moment to reflect on it might have thought, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. And now the problem's worse. And now what I'm going to do, or now we're into, the Hatfields and McCoys, and we know how counterproductive that becomes.
Well,
all
Agnes,
that to me makes good sense, but it doesn't produce anything good.
Sure. Agnes, let me circle back to some comments that David made about the January 6 participants, if I can call them that. And I think it's fair to say some of those folks are resentful because they are not completely enamored with the amount of multiculturalism happening in your country, or the amount of feminism happening in your country, or the notions of fluid sexual orientations and this kind of thing. In your judgment, what should we think about people who have huge problems with all of that?
So I think that Teresa was making a really good point about the thought that in some cases, anger is sort of epiphenomenal. It's like a flare-up of something, and there's something more fundamental lying below it. And I think she used the word ressentiment to characterize that. And you could think of that as a kind of disposition, a stable underlying disposition to feel anger, where the anger, like, I think, if your heart rate isn't rising or something, it's not really anger, right? Anger has a pretty recognizable profile. But you could have this underlying resentment. And then what that does is it disposes you to find things to be angry about, to find occasions for anger. And I also think that she's right that I really like the word license that she used. So I think that somehow we feel these days like we have a lot of license to find occasions for anger, specifically in public spaces. So I think it's probably not an accident that insurrection was in this kind of very public space. But social media is another kind of public space where it's almost like you could think of it as a desecration of the public space. Like it's a free-for-all. None of us would behave like that with our family, with our loved ones. We wouldn't just like wantonly get angry at them, even if we were in a bad mood. You can be in a bad mood and you might lash out at your spouse, but then you'd be like, I'm sorry. You wouldn't let it overtake you in that way. So I guess that's the general analysis I would give. I don't feel like I have more of a good particular grip on what was motivating that specific set of people. So I don't feel like I'm in a position to diagnose them.
Okay, well, David, let me go to you and ask whether, we need to treat people with respect and we need to treat their feelings seriously. But are we able to dismiss as irrational some of the views of those who, for example, stormed Capitol Hill in Washington?
Well, it depends on whose rationality we're talking about. You can behave in what to you seems like a rational way, while an external observer would say that makes no sense to me and seems utterly irrational. Because you're coming from a different place, you have a different set of facts, quote unquote facts, by the way, and facts are facts, but to someone who believes them, there is no distinction because they believe them, right? There might be a broader distinction that's socially determined, but for them, they deeply, deeply believe it, then what they're doing is rational. And that's part of what is so thorny about political decision making, is that if we're operating in different worlds, in different realities, based on different facts, based on different motivations, who are listening to different media folks who are telling us different quote unquote truths, then what seems reasonable and rational to one set will seem utterly irrational and unreasonable to another. And the process of politics is the process of figuring out how we live together despite that, and hopefully in a better situation trying to come to broad agreement about the world so we can minimize a lot of that friction. So I would say, looking at them, I thought there's a deep politics of resentment on the American right that has long been fostered deliberately by people for different reasons. It exists in Canada too. I think that's a kind of deep resentment-driven politics that is irrational in the sense that the grievances aren't reasonable. But to them, it certainly seems that way, that it is. So, what are you going to do about that? That's the ultimate question, is what are you going to do about that? And to sort of say, well, you're just a bunch of idiot bumpkins, you're a basket of deplorables, it doesn't do it. And I think that's one of the, especially on the left, something we've got to reckon with in the contemporary world, is that simply dismissing these folks as, angry rubes isn't going to do it. It doesn't work.
Hillary's never going to get over saying basket of deplorables, is she?
I probably shouldn't.
Gotcha. Okay, Teresa, reactionary feelings, are they worth less than progressive feelings, particularly when you look at what happened on Capitol Hill that day?
We have reactionary feelings, and I've been writing on reactionism for a while, so it's interesting to try to unpick what that is. But we also have radical feelings, and we have retrogressive feelings, and progressive feelings, and conservative feelings. So we think we're dealing with two opposites, but it's more of a well-rounded account of how you could be thinking of political orientations as harboring a particular affective profile. So there is an interesting similarity between the affective content of extreme politics, whether they sit on the left or they sit on the right. And what we find is that this desire to undo the present and move towards something else is very often motivated by resentment. But that's not necessarily ressentiment. It's not the sour and toxic grievance that we see played out in politics very often in the more retrogressive parts of the electorate that want to turn things back, but they are not willing to work for it. Reactionaries, so perhaps I'm introducing a lot of complexity to this conversation, but reactionaries and radicals do not have a very good relationship with the present. They want to undo the present in a very abrupt and often violent way. But what they like to do is either turn things back, reactionary orientation, or move things forward to an unknown future, radical orientation. But you have other spaces in between in these orientations. You could think of the retrogressive citizens who are not comfortable with the present. They are not conservatives. They don't like things to stay as they are. They want to move things back, but their desire for acting, for change, is inhibited by their emotional experiences, which is, in essence, resentimentful, which is passively angry, dormantly endorsing violence, sometimes engaging with it, but not actively going out there seeking it. You could be part of a movement by accident without you being the one organizing it. Now, that is a characteristic of a really particular emotional mechanism that takes your envy, your shame, your inefficacious anger, and converts it into resentment. So resentment could be what you see at the output of it, but the process is a really particular process that is very painful and involves what we identify as a transvaluation, a change of the value. And this is really interesting, because when we talk about emotions, or when we talk about ideologies, when we talk about anger, you wouldn't expect to be witnessing this process of the change of values, of the things that you desire, which you cannot attain, which into something that then you put aside as worthless, as not desirable anymore. So this devaluation of what was initially desired, the unattainable is devalued, and the sense of self from being an individual that doesn't get what that individual wants, an individual that perceives themselves as at the margins of society, perhaps a loser, changes their own perception of their self into a pious and moral victim. And that moral victimhood is the sign, the clear sign that we're not dealing with anger. We're dealing with resentment.
Okay, let me pick up on that and take that to David, because David, I want to pick up on something you wrote in one of your columns in the Washington Post, where you wrote, "In a democracy, reactionary grievance politics that produces violence should be intolerable." Okay, explain why.
Well, because by the time you've reached that, you can no longer get together and decide how we ought to live together. It's sort of saying like, well, we're going to bargain about how we want to run the house, but I'm going to hold a gun to your head. And then let's have a chat about how we want to, who's going to take out the garbage, right? I mean, like you can't bargain under those situations, because no longer are you recognizing the other person sitting across from you as a person who has moral equal worth, in a democracy in which we self-govern, more or less self-govern. It's a different episode, and again, about how little we actually self-govern. But let's just say, for the purposes here, that we have self-government. Well, then we can't do it, right? And so by the time someone's occupying the Capitol or occupying Ottawa, in a convoy, you've sort of passed the point of democratic politics, and you've entered something else. Although I'll put a little bit of a caveat there. There are moral moments in which that is necessary. Think of the civil rights movement in the United States and some of the more radical elements of that. Those were necessary for breaking a wall that wasn't going to be broken with democratic deliberation. Right, which I happen to quite like, but there's some moments where you don't. But this is where we have to sort of click off the liberal intuition that's embedded so deeply in each of us and say some things are substantially different than others, and we need to distinguish between, say, that kind of manifestation when it's in battle for civil rights for racialized folks and people who don't want to get a vaccine. Right. So we have to make those substantive distinctions, which itself is a democratic social process that we have to go through. But by the time people have become violent for bad reasons, democracy has broken down to the point where it has to be stopped and better institutions have to be reasserted.
In which case, Agnes, let me get your take on the, roughly 20 or 30% of the population in both your country and mine that have developed reactionary, anti-modern feelings. They are angry at the world. A world which doesn't seem to care very much about what they think about various things. What's your take on that?
Okay, so I guess as a philosopher, I distinguish practical questions from theoretical questions. But maybe one of the really distinctive features of public life is people are always trying to make decisions they can't make in a public way. Like, here's what we should do, even though that isn't going to be done by your saying it. And so it often confuses me. But I think there is stuff we can do individually. That is, you can individually talk to the people you can talk to. And there's a question, how do you interact with someone if they're expressing resentful sentiments? How do you talk to such a person? How do you talk to such people on Twitter? Right. So those are actual situations we can encounter. There isn't I don't think there's some immediate lever we can press at a governmental level where we do something to those people, right? That's not an option that's on the table. So from my point of view, there's no point in deliberating what we should do when we can't do anything. But I guess I think that the best I've been able to find is to interact with people inquisitively, and to see whether there is anything that you have to learn from them. And people are pretty receptive to other people having that approach. And they're pretty resistant to people who have the approach of, without at all thinking that I might have something to learn from you, let me teach you a bunch of things about how you're wrong.
That feels like very good advice. Less than 5 minutes to go here. Let's see if we can get a couple of more things on the table. Therese, I'll come to you on the issue of resentment because you have studied that in Greece. You live currently in the United Kingdom. Do individual cultures express resentments differently?
Yes, there's always, emotions are always culturally embedded, right? So they are experienced, they are expressed, they are recognized, and they're acted out, or they are performed differently in different cultures. But our role as political psychologists, social scientists, is to trying to understand the commonalities across cultures. Of course, understanding the nuance in different places. Cultures are not just the only thing of the story. It's also the social political environment, the context, which is not just about culture, is what's going on at a particular place at a given point in time. And at the time we were studying ressentiment in Greece, that was during the financial crisis. And so it was a really pressurized crisis environment. And we were really interested in understanding how people respond to this. And we've also looked at similar pressurized environments in the United Kingdom around the Brexit time, where there were different kinds of grievances. But what we found, which was similar, and in the US, where we looked at data there, but what we found across these different political and cultural systems, they call them like that, is that there was a common response to politics, which was to deal with politics through grievance. So expressing grievances, identifying grievances, looking at politics as the place of grievance was the similarity that we saw across these three contexts. And that got us thinking that perhaps a very new phenomenon that we are encountering is that of grievance politics, which is approaching political debate, political disagreement, political frustrations from a grievance perspective, which immediately puts the other as your opponent, immediately not an opponent that you want to debate in a deliberative democracy fashion, but as somebody that you want to eliminate, to dominate. So there is a really interesting particular way of engaging with the social relationships that constitute democratic politics. And what David was saying before is linked to this, that once you start dealing with anybody else as somebody that is out to get you, somebody who has pushed you out, or somebody who has taken away what is rightfully yours, and you could do this either in real locales or online, then you start engaging with people in a really particular emotional tone. And that is not a tone that can provide pro-social outcomes.
Right. Let me save a minute here. We're down to our last minute. Let me save it for David, because you're here in Canada, but you write about Canada for an American publication. So I wonder if have you come to any conclusions about whether we're becoming more like them?
I think Canada is becoming slightly more polarized. There's some data on this. Edelman has a trust barometer, and they look at polarization. The data was fairly interesting, is that Canada is shifting to a more toxic polarized. There's nothing inherently wrong about being polarized. Toxic polarization is different. We're becoming less trusting as well. And I rushed to add this because we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but there's also a class dimension to this that is utterly central to understanding a lot of this, and that there's a huge class divide. And that when you break down a lot of the data and the numbers, you do see a class divide on things, for instance, like trust, and that's significant as well. And I do think, we have been insulated against some of it, in part because of our national institutions, some cultural bits, and some social programming, which helps a lot. But I do worry that that's eroding, and that we're moving towards a more toxic, polarized environment. The old cliche is that we're sort of 10 years behind America. It's not a bad heuristic, and probably there's something to it in this case.
Gotcha. David Mostrop, Agnes Callard, Teresa Capellos, we thank all three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and having this most interesting conversation. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Few names have such a powerful association with capitalism as Adam Smith. Even if you don't know his name or his seminal 18th century text, The Wealth of Nations, you've likely encountered the premise of the invisible hand and its role in the free market. But according to Glory Liu's new book, Smith as an icon of capitalism is actually a historical invention. She is a lecturer in social studies at Harvard. Her book is called Adam Smith's America. And Glory M. Liu joins us now from Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's great to have you on the program. Glory, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Not at all. Let's go back. Adam Smith was born 300 years ago. He published his famous Wealth of Nations, the year of America's founding, just as the Industrial Revolution was getting off the ground. I guess the first question is, why are we still talking about him all this time later?
We still talk about Adam Smith because we have a fascination with the ideas that he wrote, not only in The Wealth of Nations, but also in his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759. I think what Adam Smith really did for the world, not just for America, was to introduce a whole new set of questions and a whole new way of thinking about the rise of a new type of society he called commercial society, where everybody lives by exchange. And he was witnessing the great transformation of that society, the way that the modern economy really influenced modern politics and vice versa. And that's what he wrote about in The Wealth of Nations. And that's why the book is still so important today, because we still grapple with the relationship between politics and the economy and morality.
Now, you talk about something called the Adam Smith problem. What is that?
So the Adam Smith problem is a pretty niche scholarly question that is introduced in late 19th century Germany about the compatibility between self-interest on the one hand and sympathy on the other. Self-interest is seen as the kind of motivating force of human behavior in The Wealth of Nations, Smith's most famous book, published in 1776, as you said. And sympathy is seen as the linchpin of his theory of morality in the first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And these German scholars wondered, how could it be possible that this one thinker wrote these two books with two completely different views of human nature? So there's a philosophical question about the compatibility or the consistency between self-interest and sympathy on the one hand, but there was also a question about Smith's own intellectual development. Did he change his mind sometime between writing The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations? That question or that problem was put to rest pretty quickly. If you pick up an edition of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, you'll see in the editor's introduction, for example, that most people think that the Adam Smith problem is a pseudo problem.
All right, well, we're going to come back to that in a bit. But first of all, you know, I think we need a bit of an accounting of his life. He was born in Scotland. He died in Scotland. But I'd like to know more about what happened during those 67 intervening years of his life. What should we know?
He led a fairly uninteresting life relative to other kind of great 18th century luminaries, but at the same time, it is really interesting because of what subsequent people have made out of it. And I think because where he did go and maybe where he didn't go deeply influenced what he wrote about. So Smith goes to the University of Glasgow. He then moves to the University of Oxford, where he undertakes his studies there. He then lectures in Edinburgh and then becomes a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. Really, really crucially, he becomes a tutor to the stepson of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, so basically like the Secretary of the Treasury. And as the tutor to this young duke, he travels around Europe in the 1760s. I believe the dates are 17. I'm going to get it wrong because I'm live on television. But in the 1760s, he's traveling around Europe, and he goes to Paris and Geneva and Toulouse, and then the travels are cut short, and he returns to England, and he splits his time between London and Kirkcaldy, Scotland, where he's born and where he grows up, and he lives with his mom actually for a really long time.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess.
Yeah. So Smith's exposure to French and Genevan ideas and the group of political economists and philosophers in that part of the world really opens his eyes to debates in political economy in the 1760s and deeply inform what he writes about in The Wealth of Nations.
They said some kind of not nice things about him back in the day. For example, he had big teeth, they said. He was ugly as the devil, it was also said. Any evidence that you've uncovered that he was unhappy about being single and not very appealing?
Yeah, so some of the quotes that you read and, these ideas about Smith as the kind of awkward perpetual bachelor. He lived with his mom and never married, never even had any lovers that's suspected. As kind of awkward and perhaps lonely. We don't really know if he was truly lonely or not, but despite that picture of Smith that you just painted, we do know that he had many, many fans and that people loved him as a teacher and that he was a very endearing person and very good company too. So I think, for all of his shortcomings, perhaps as a kind of lonely bachelor, he made up being an interesting conversationalist, a teacher, instructor, and a great mind. And that's what people were attracted to in some senses.
For sure. Let's do an excerpt from the book here, shall we? Sheldon, top of page 2. Let's bring this graphic up. Smith's relevance has always been political, but it's no stretch to say that the events of the last decade alone have led readers to rediscover his immediate relevance with even more urgency. Studies on Smith's views on economic inequality, the normative stakes of economic growth, and his conception of the moral economy reveal just how saturated public and academic discourses have become with questions concerning the morality of capitalism. We're also told that Adam Smith had a pretty serious impact on Alexander Hamilton, who, of course, is one of your founding fathers in the United States, and, of course, more importantly for this generation, the subject of a very popular musical on Broadway. How did Smith influence Hamilton?
Yeah, so I sort of reverse that question the way I take it up in my book, which is not so much how did Smith influence Hamilton, but what exactly drew Hamilton to the writings of Adam Smith in the first place. So the way I answer that question is to suggest that Hamilton was drawn to Adam Smith because Smith offered a way of thinking about the forces of economic growth and the extent to which the national government needed to encourage that growth by passing and enacting certain policies like protective tariffs, subsidies, or building really, really strong financial institutions. And Smith had extensive commentary on policies like subsidies, tariffs, protection for infant industry, and kind of policies for sound banking. What's interesting is that Hamilton goes to those parts of the text and uses the parts that suit his particular needs for the kind of agenda and the kind of financial institutions he wants to build, and a vision for a really strong nationalist government, or I should say kind of economic nationalist government. And those are almost at odds with what Smith has to say. Smith is known for being a champion of free trade. He doesn't like subsidies. He doesn't like protective tariffs. But in the particular circumstances that Alexander Hamilton is working in, right? We have a brand new nation. We have a fledgling economy. He's worried about predatory policies from rivals like Great Britain and like France. So he takes those parts of Smith that seem most congenial to the American situation in the 1790s.
Let me take you forward to the lead up to the Civil War in the mid-19th century. And maybe you could talk to us about how Smith's ideas played a role in the debate separating the North from the South in the lead up to the Civil War.
Sure. So the part that I focus on are tariff debates. And what's really interesting is that Smith gets weaponized on both sides of the tariff debate. So on the one hand, you have the representatives from the Cotton South saying, I will lay my position down on the authority of Adam Smith. He's the founder of this science. And what they're saying is that, free trade is really grounded in this science of universal political economy, and that the expansion of free trade would create a national political economy that would harmonize the interests of the South with those of the North. But what's kind of in the subtext of that statement is the expansion of slavery to support that system. So for many people in the South, appealing to the ideas of Adam Smith and calling upon the principles of free trade and the science of political economy was a way to advance their vision of a national political economy that relied on the expansion of slavery. But in the North, they're much more skeptical, not only of the very policy of free trade, but really of this idea of a kind of like national political economy that was grounded in some of the ideas that Smith wrote about. And so they are much more in favor of higher tariffs. And the way that they appeal to Adam Smith is almost to delegitimize the policy of free trade and to say, well, even Smith said that the most important market is the home market. So if the apostle of free trade said and made exceptions for free trade, then maybe we should pay attention to that too. So Smith becomes almost a mascot, a way of signaling one's allegiance to a particular policy, and it becomes very politically valuable to show that you can have Smith on your side.
So if I read you correctly, it would be the wrong thing to do to basically limit our understanding of Smith to, quote unquote, being the apostle of free trade.
I think that's right. There's a reason why he became known as the apostle of free trade. And it was at a particular moment in our history that made that version of Smith particularly powerful. But that isn't the only version of Smith that has been powerful. And it's not even necessarily the most accurate version of Smith.
Well, okay, I got to follow up on that because clearly there has been a right-wing portrait of Adam Smith that has emerged and persisted over the years, but you've also kind of unearthed a more left-wing version of Adam Smith as well. Tell us why you believe, I guess, the more compelling right-wing version of Smith is the one that has persisted over the other one.
Yeah, and I would just add that saying something that like the right-wing version of Smith has persisted doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. And that what I really try to do in this book is explain why we get really powerful versions of Smith, even if they're seen as misreadings or misunderstandings, if you will. And I try to set aside those judgments and really just explain, why do these ideas become so powerful? Now, I think that the so-called right-wing version of Smith that you alluded to, which is associated with free market capitalism, deregulation, free enterprise, and this idea of freedom of choice from the perspective of the consumer, became so powerful because it entered public discourse at a moment when those ideas really, really resonated with the American public. And some of the largest proponents of that version of Adam Smith I talk about in the book are people like Milton Friedman, who is not only an award-winning economist, but also an incredibly powerful and popular public intellectual who does become associated with a certain version of American conservatism or libertarianism, if you will. And what Friedman really did was to translate some of Smith's most famous ideas like self-interest and the invisible hand, and almost put them in, you could say, like in a vernacular, right? He made the invisible hand of Adam Smith the invisible hand of the market. And I think that Friedman's genius was to really bring Smith down to earth and to show that Smith gave a version of economic thought that enshrined the values of personal freedom in the marketplace, and that we needed to protect those freedoms from the tyranny of the government. Now, say what you want about Milton Friedman, you can disagree with his politics, but what I try to show in my book is that that interpretation of Adam Smith had a lot of power and really resonated in the American public at the time it emerged.
Well, I well remember that because it was about 40 years ago when Ronald Reagan was the president. And I guess the combination of Milton Friedman's kind of quirky, almost fun personality, even though he was sort of a short, balding, Jewish, not particularly dazzling looking guy, combined with Ronald Reagan, who was, of course, this tall, strapping, very funny, waspy-looking president. That combination, backing that version of Adam Smith, I guess proved to be irresistible. Is that fair to say?
I think it was irresistible, and it's not just because of Friedman's personality and his charisma, but because he really did advance an interpretation of Smith that had a grounding in Friedman's own approach to what economics was as a science, how to see the world through the lens of prices and the market, how the market could allocate efficiently and enhance human freedom. And then he found these phrases and these images in Adam Smith that aligned with that vision, and he really popularized it. And I think that was just a really effective way to propagate a particular interpretation of Smith. Yeah.
So I guess the follow-up question, Gloria, is, was Milton Friedman wrong in your view?
I get this question a lot, and it's hard to answer. So yes and no. I would say that, or rather, wrong maybe isn't the right way to characterize what Friedman did. I would say that Friedman's interpretation of Smith is incredibly narrow, and you could say radically simplified. So in some ways, Friedman was drawing on a social theoretical insight from Smith about the invisible hand, that there can be at times socially beneficial consequences to individual actions that promote the public good. And at the same time, he really narrowed in and took that to be kind of the only defining feature of Smith's work and kind of excluded other interpretations of Smith, right? Friedman isn't really talking about the theory of moral sentiments. He's not interested in a kind of whole interpretation of all of Smith's works and how Smith would have thought about these questions in Smith's time. What Friedman is doing is taking one insight from Smith's philosophy and political economy and just running with it, right? And making that the complete story. So I'm hesitant, and maybe this is my kind of like historian in me, to say that Friedman was altogether wrong. What I would say is that he was incredibly selective and very narrow, to the exclusion, and to the exclusion of so much of what we know of Smith today.
Well, let's have a little fun with the alternative version then. If it hadn't been the invisible hand that he is pretty much exclusively known for today, What other competing narrative might we be advancing to get the whole picture of Adam Smith today?
One really compelling competing narrative that I think has emerged in the last decade or so is this idea of Smith as a critic of modern commercial society and at some longer removed modern capitalism, and Smith as somebody who was deeply concerned with extreme wealth accumulation and inequality. So one of the passages that's frequently discussed and debated comes from the theory of moral sentiments, not just any part of the theory of moral sentiments, but a chapter that Smith added in 1790. This is the sixth revision or sixth edition of the theory of moral sentiments. And he goes back to the theory of moral sentiments after he writes The Wealth of Nations, right? And in this passage, he says that the disposition to admire the rich and powerful and to ignore the poor and people of low condition is the greatest and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiment. Right? So if you kind of take that sentence and he says, wow, the way in which we admire the wealthy and neglect the poor is the most universal and greatest cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments, right? It jumps out at you and makes it seem like Smith is talking about all of our issues now about why we are so preoccupied with inequality and not just inequality as an economic phenomenon, but inequality as a moral and social phenomenon and problem as well. And I think that those discussions, Smith's worries about the advancement of the division of labor and how the advancement of the division of labor at a very, very, you could say at a very, very long remove, or rather, like when the division of labor becomes so advanced, it has this tendency to degrade and corrupt our mind and body. Right? And so I think now we're seeing how those kinds of discussions from Smith's works, both the theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations, throw Smith into very high relief again as we are having these conversations about the normative stakes of economic growth, as we're having conversations about, globalization and the global division of labor, or as we're having conversations about the moral and political causes and consequences of economic inequality. So I think that is a very different version of Smith that we didn't get in the era of Milton Friedman, and it's really coming to the fore now.
Sure. So in which case, and again, with the benefit of a few decades of hindsight here, what do you think Milton Friedman really missed in his interpretation of things?
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I think Milton Friedman missed out on the lectures on jurisprudence. So yes, of course, he didn't really talk about the theory of moral sentiments, but what Milton Friedman and what some of his colleagues like George Stigler, another Chicago economist writing around the same time, and many economists in the 20th century missed out on was Smith's politics, right? They kind of pushed away Smith's political theory in favor of a view that kind of economics was the science of everything, and that they could use economics and kind of the market mechanism to explain political phenomena and social phenomenon as well. And what I am really interested in is going back to Smith's political theory, his history, as well as his moral philosophy and political economy, and recovering Smith as a political thinker, as somebody who thought about the nature of politics in a very particular way that was deeply attentive to history and the kind of brutal reality of modern life.
Well, if we're having fun with this, let's keep going. If he were alive today, would Smith be a Democrat or a Republican?
Neither. I am so practiced at answering this question. So I think one of the most interesting things about Smith and one of the most fun things about studying Smith today is that he's a thinker who defies these conventional political categories, right? It's very, very common, and we often have this impulse to want to categorize Smith and slot him into our labels. But I think Smith really defines those boundaries, right? For every left version of Smith, there is a right version of Smith, whether it's part of our own creation, but I also think it's part of the way Smith thinks. He's very, very balanced, and he's happy to kind of present tensions and contradictions to draw our eyes to them, but not necessarily to resolve them. And so I think that's why we get competing versions of Smith. And that's also why it's impossible to want to put Smith into one category or the other today.
Cable TV, of course, would never accept that answer because they would be determined to categorize him in one way or the other. So could we say he's maybe a Reagan Democrat or a Boll Weevil Republican, that kind of thing?
No. No,
Okay.
I'm just going to leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough. Do you wish you'd met Adam Smith?
Yes. And at the same time, I don't think Adam Smith would have been as fun as meeting David Hume, who I think is funnier. But of course, I would have loved to meet Adam Smith. I want to know what he had written in the books that he had burned right before he died. And I want him to explain to me why he decided to title sections of his book Digressions, because that did not serve him very well. But yes, I would have loved to have met Adam Smith.
Let me ask you this. I think I've interviewed tens of thousands of people on this program, and I have to say, I think there's only been one with the first name Glory. There's got to be a story there. What's the story, Glory Liu?
Well, when my mom was pregnant with me, she was reading the Bible at the time, and she came across a Bible verse from Psalm 84:11, which says, "The Lord is my sun and shield; He gives grace and glory." And my older sister, who is 8 years older than me, is named Grace. And so my mom came across this verse and said, "Well, I guess I'll name the next girl Glory."
That is outstanding. More for our viewers' edification in Glory Liu's book, Adam Smith's America. And we're delighted that she could join us, the Harvard University lecturer from Cambridge, Massachusetts, as a graduate of Boston University, I would say, on the wrong side of the Charles River, but that's okay. We're glad you joined us anyway.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, March 29th, 2023. Why is there a push to legalize magic mushrooms for medical uses? We'll find out tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.